Welcome to Module 5 of the Microsoft Certified Azure Administrator training course. In today's module, we're going to be taking a look at the fifth objective of the AZ-103 exam, which is managing identities. Today, we're going to break down the managing identities objective into the 5 sub-objective areas. As we go through each of these theory modules, we're going to explain to you the concepts and theories that you need to be aware of to sit and pass the exam. Then we'll provide a briefing for the lab exercises that you need to do to gain the hands-on experience necessary to allow you to sit, pass the exam. Also at the end, there'll be a recap on course housekeeping, frequently asked questions. Let's start off by taking a look at the objectives for the AZ-103 exam with regards to managing identities, so we're aware of what we need to learn to be ready for the exam. As a Microsoft Certified Azure Administrator, you're going to be expected to be capable and confident to work with Azure Active Directory. That means managing Azure AD objects like users, groups, and devices. You need to be able to implement hybrid identity management. That means using tools like Azure AD Connect to implement directory synchronization and password writeback to synchronize and provide single sign-on between Active Directory domain services and Azure AD. You also need to be competent in configuring and administering multi-factor authentication to make sure that access to the Azure portal is authenticated in a rigorous manner. In Objective 5, Lesson A, we're going to take a deep dive look into managing Azure Active Directory. In the AZ-103 exam, it's highly likely that we'll come across questions that test our knowledge of applying custom domain names to Azure AD tenants, configuring AD join, configuring self-service password reset, and being able to manage multiple directories within a single Azure AD tenant. Let's quickly recap on some of the concepts we covered in the AZ-900 Fundamentals course about Azure Active Directory. So what is Azure AD? Put simply, it's a directory service built into Azure. It's a software as a service directory service. That means we don't have to be concerned with building servers like domain controllers or name resolution servers. The infrastructure is provided for us automatically when we create a new Azure AD tenant. The art of signing up for a free trial in Azure or signing up for an Azure tenant will create that Azure AD service for us. Azure AD not only controls access to the resources we will create in Azure, but it will also can be used to control access to software as a service applications like SAP, ServiceNow, Gmail, Dropbox, and a number of others. If you're familiar with Office 365 or the Microsoft 365 technology suite, those technologies build on Azure Active Directory as their directory service. Most organizations today already have a directory service in place, and that's typically Windows Server Active Directory domain services. Now, Windows Server AD domain services is not the same thing as Azure Active Directory, but we can make a hybrid identity service by joining up on-premise Active Directory with Azure AD. That would allow users who have an account in on-premise Active Directory domain service to be able to log onto and authenticate into Azure AD and get access to the resources that it controls using those credentials that they have in Windows Server Active Directory. So, what we're going to do in the following slides is we're going to go through some of the concepts of how we create hybrid identity and discuss what we can do to create user objects in Azure AD. When we create a brand new Azure AD tenant, automatically Microsoft will create a friendly domain name for us. Now that domain name will be something like the name of our organization .onmicrosoft.com. That's created for us automatically. So we can basically create an Azure AD domain and it's there and it's ready for us to work with. However, one of the steps we frequently need to do is to add what we call a vanity domain. That's where we go out to a third-party domain name registrar and register a domain name. For example, in this case, contoso.com. What we then need to do is add that contoso.com domain to our Azure AD tenant. What that then means by adding that custom domain to it, the Azure AD domain is able to handle things like email addresses, user identities, using the somebody at contoso.com naming structure in addition to fabricam.onmicrosoft.com. Because we have to integrate it with a third-party provider, Well, one of the things we need to do is prove to Azure AD that we own that custom domain name. So what we'll need to do is go work with our internet service provider that creates our DNS record for our custom domain. And we're going to create one of two types of custom records in there. The two types we would create are either a text record or an MX record. Now, a text record tends to be the simplest one to do. We create a host record that's just called @, and then we set the destination for that record to point to a service identifier, which is ms equals ms and then a number, and that will basically be our instance ID for Azure AD. We also need to set a time to live value on that record as well. So typically we set that to be 3600 seconds. Once we've done that in our third-party domain name provider, once we've created that DNS record, we then come into Azure AD. We might need to wait up to 24 hours for those domain name records to replicate around the world. But once we've done that, we can come into Azure AD, hit the verify button, and Azure AD will query our DNS record. It will query public DNS just to make sure that record exists that we've created and it's configured as we've said it will be. By doing that, what we've done is we've proved to Microsoft that we're able to create that record just as they've specified us to do. That means that we're obviously in ownership of that domain. So by doing this, we're proving to Azure AD that we own that domain name and that we can use it. Once we've done that, that custom domain name can be used for user accounts, it can be used for email addresses, and it can also be used in websites like the single sign-on portal for Azure AD. If we want to allow our workstation or our computer to be able to authenticate a user based on their Azure AD user account, we need to do something called Azure AD join. What that means is we configure our workstation to have a relationship with Azure AD, where our workstation knows about the Azure AD directory, it knows we've got an account in there, and that basically the computer will then trust Azure AD to authenticate any user sessions or any user logons. It's basically a way of allowing us to do single sign-on from our workstation. So when we come along to launch things like Office 365 or sign into the Azure AD portal, we can use those credentials that we've used to authenticate against Azure AD. We'll get a token from that we can use to access other resources in Azure AD. It's important to note that Azure AD join is not the same thing as joining an Active Directory domain. There's many differences between that. One of the most fundamental ones is Active Directory Domain Services has technologies like group policy for configuring workstations and computers. Azure AD doesn't have the same level of capability for that. It can do an element of device management, but Azure AD join doesn't put Azure in charge of our workstation or our computer. What it does do is allow our computer to authenticate users when they log on using credentials from Azure AD, and that's not the same thing as a computer joining the domain. One of the most frequently undertaken administrative requests people are asked to do with Active Directory domain services is to reset somebody's password. We obviously have requirements to make sure people have complex passwords, but unfortunately it's not always easy for people to remember those passwords. Hence, people do one of two things. They either forget their password periodically, or they write it down and keep it on a sticky note somewhere. So neither of those two outcomes is ideal. What we do to reduce the administrative burden associated with resetting passwords and to speed up end user productivity, within Azure AD, there's some built-in functionality for self-service password resets. Now that functionality is built into Azure AD. We don't need to buy any additional modules or anything for that. That functionality is already in place, along with the integration with what we call identity providers. So what we're able to do here is basically use things like sending a text to our mobile phone, doing a voice call to a mobile phone or an office phone, or sending an email to an alternative email address to prove that we are the person we say we are that needs to reset their password. It's really important we've got an alternative way of verifying people that way, because if they've forgotten their password, they'll need to have some other way we can authenticate them to log them in. So, configuring self-service password is actually quite straightforward. There's two steps to it. First of all, in Azure AD, we need to enable the service, and we need to put some configuration in there to tell Azure AD how we're going to allow it to authenticate people. By doing that, what we're able to do is say how many different methods do we force users to provide to prove they are who they say they are. And what we can do as well is whitelist which methods of them proving their identity they can use. So the choices are to be able to use the mobile app, which is where Azure provides a mobile app that runs on an iOS or an Android device that basically stores a constantly resetting one-time password value, or we can send an authentication request to that app. The other options are sending an email to an alternative email address, or having the voice service in Azure make a voice telephone call to our mobile phone or an office phone, and it will basically speak and say to a person, hello, this is the one-time password. You then enter that number in there, or you can either authenticate by typing in your PIN in the voice call, or by typing in the one-time password that the voice call gives to you. We can also authenticate using a text message or by answering security questions. Quite frequently, though, the security stakeholders in your organization will have a very strong view on which of those authentication methods are most appropriate to use. The ones that are most frequently used are office phones and mobile phone methods. But the Azure mobile app is becoming increasingly popular, and it's regarded to be a very safe way of proving identity. Don't get confused with multi-factor authentication. There is a separate multi-factor authentication service we implement in Azure. For now, all we need to be aware of is that when we configure self-service password reset, we've got to have some alternative way of validating a user. We'll talk more about multi-factor authentication later on. In Objective 5, Lesson B, we're going to take a look at how we use Azure AD to create user objects, group objects, and to take a look at how we can work with devices. The exam objectives for AZ-103 are quite clear. For managing Azure AD objects, we need to be capable and confident in doing the following things: creating user objects and group objects, managing the properties of users and groups, being able to manage device settings, performing bulk user updates, and also managing guest user accounts. Because Azure AD is a cloud software as a service offering that provides us with a directory service, there's a built-in user interface in the Azure portal that allows us to do user administration. So if you go into the Azure portal and if you search on Azure Active Directory, if it isn't in your navigation blades already, you can add that in there. By clicking on Azure Active Directory, you can go in there. If you've not already configured your Azure Active Directory organization with some basic things like, do you want to use self-service? Do you want to use multi-factor authentication? Do you want to apply some branding to the self-service portal? So when you log in there, it looks like something that belongs to your organization. You'll be prompted to do so the first time you go in there. You can also use that GUI in the portal to be able to create user objects, guest objects, perform things like password resets, delete users, enable multi-factor authentication, and move people from one group to another. It's actually a very intuitive user interface. If you've ever done any work with Office 365, it'll look very familiar to you. That's because Azure AD is the same directory service engine that's used for Office 365 and for Dynamics 365 and for Microsoft Intune that's used to control access to our Azure resources. If we want to create a user, we browse to Azure Active Directory in the Azure portal. We click on the All Users blade, and then in there's a button at the top called New User. We click that, and that's going to open up this dialog box we can see on the right-hand side here. So users would have some mandatory attributes that need to be configured with them. They need a name. They also need to have a username, which will be their name at contoso.com or on Fabricam on Microsoft.com, whatever the two domains we've got. Remember, we're going to have a Microsoft domain name, which is something on Microsoft.com, and hopefully as well we'll have added a vanity domain name as well. That will give us the ability to select at contoso.com as the domain name. We can also configure a profile and individual properties for the users. At this point as well, we can add them to groups. So group membership determines what objects they have the ability to access. Typically speaking, those are Office 365 resources. That'll be things like SharePoint sites, distribution lists in Exchange hosted services, and maybe things like team sites. For the sake of Azure administration, we're probably more likely to be adding them to administrative roles where that gives them contributor or reader access or owner access to a set of resources in Azure. And that could be nested through group objects as well. In Azure AD, we also have the concept of the directory role for a user. That means every user object in here has a role. So if we want to create somebody that can create user objects in Azure AD, we can create them as a directory administrator. Or if they're just somebody that comes in and uses services, in Azure AD terms, they would just be a user. And we can do one of two things in here as well. We can also specify a password for them, or the user interface can automatically generate a complex password for us, and we can send that password to them as a text message or to an alternative email address to allow them to get signed in and use the service. In Azure AD, we use group objects to reflect part of our organizational structure. So it's not uncommon to make a group for project developers in your organization. So maybe you've got 3 software development teams, you might create 3 groups, give the groups an appropriate name. There's different types of groups available. One is basically for a mailing list, the other one is for security groups. And we've also got roles as well. The idea being that we give the group a name, and then that group gets nested into a role within Azure, or it gets granted permission to some set of resources. It's really important when we create the name for our group and we populate the group description that we try to self-document as we go. So when other administrators come along and try to figure out, well, if I add them to this group, what is that going to give them? We've got different types of membership types as well. We've got the idea of assigned membership. What assigned membership is, somebody needs to come along and choose to make you a member of that group. The alternative is we can basically have a query-based membership where what will happen is, depending on some other attributes or some kind of rule, you'll be added to that group automatically based on, say, what your job title is or what other resources you've got access to. If we want to create a new group, we can do that from within the Azure AD portal as well. Just underneath the All Users Management blade, there is a Groups blade. We can click on that. It's important to remember as well, there's 2 ways to look at group membership. One is we can look at an individual user and through their properties see which groups they are a member of. We can also use the All Groups dialog box to look at a particular group object and see which users are a member of that group. One of the attributes that Azure AD gives us with groups as well is the concept of a group owner. What we can do is basically tag somebody with their email address and make them the owner for the group. There is some self-service group management functionality in Azure AD that can be enabled. And what we can do is basically set it up so that if somebody wants to join a group to get access to some resources, they can use a portal to request that access, and an authentication request is sent by email to the owner of that group who can approve or deny that. In addition to having basic settings, each user object also has a profile. A profile provides us with a bit more information. One of the most considerable differences between on-prem Active Directory and Azure AD is the fact that we'll generally associate a profile picture of the user. Now that could be something like a logo, or it could be a profile picture of that user's face, like a portrait shot. If we don't configure one, Azure AD will automatically create a bitmap file that just contains the user's initials and set that as their ID. It's good practice to encourage users to come along and create a profile and maybe to include that in your onboarding processes. From a user's profile, we can see things like what their picture is. We can change that picture for them by loading a file. We're also able to see identity information like the name, their first name and last name, their username, what type of role they play within the directory. We can also copy their object ID from there as well. And we've also got some other controls in there as well. For example, we can populate their job title, their department name. We can also put their manager's name in there as well. From the settings side of things, one of the things we can do is block sign-in. So if I select yes to the block sign-in option for this user, they won't be able to authenticate again until we reset that. That's a bit like locking them out. We've also got a usage location as well. So what we can do is determine, say, where this user is actually based. And then in addition to that, we've got other kind of information we track about them as well, like contact information. It's quite simple to go in using the portal and configure this information. If a user rings us up and tells us that they don't know what their password is and they don't know how to use self-service password reset, or we've chosen not to enable that, we can come in as an administrator and click the reset password button on their profile. What's good about that is, as well as changing their password, it will generate a complex password to use for them, and we can also have it send them an email with that new password in. Now that complex password will just be a temporary one that will force them to use the password reset dialog boxes in Azure AD to have them change their password the next time they log on. Azure Active Directory gives us two types of roles. We have the concept of directory roles. These are the people that have administrative privileges in the Azure Active Directory. Now those people may not necessarily be the same group of people that have administrative rights within Azure. That's because the Azure administrators are looking after infrastructure and applications, whereas Azure directory administrators are looking after the organization's directory service and who has administrative and who has a membership of groups. It's not unforeseeable that those roles might be separated within your organization. However, the directory roles spell out some pretty handy out-of-the-box roles we can use. So for example, we have a role called application developer, and that will allow people to be able to create some resources in Azure. We've got other things as well, like billing administrator, cloud device administrator, cloud application administrator. Essentially, these are built-in roles that we can use to give people the right level of access to do their job. Additionally, in addition to the out-of-the-box roles, it's also possible to create custom roles and grant them access to resources or groups of resources using role-based access controls. One of the things Azure AD will provide for us is an element of mobile device management. Now, there is a full-blown MDM solution built on Azure AD called Microsoft Intune. But it's also important to remember that basic Azure AD provides some very basic very basic mobile device management functionality as well. Now, depending on what kind of license you've got for your end users, whether they've actually bought an Intune license for them, or whether they've got an Office 365 Premium license, or if they're an Azure AD Premium license holder, they're able to have certain levels of functionality. But it's really important to us as a systems administrator to be able to say, well, what we're going to do is we're going to allow you to log on, but we're only going to allow you to log on from an approved device. Or maybe we want to do some sort of inspection of their device to make sure that their authentication, that in addition to authenticating their username and password, the device they're connecting from is secure or it's a trusted device. So we can use the devices section in the Azure AD portal to come along and look at the devices that users have enrolled. As you can see under the join type column in this table, we're able to see whether they were hybrid Azure AD joined, Azure AD registered, Azure AD joined, or maybe they're enrolled in Intune. So there are a couple of different types of enrollment within Azure AD that determines whether just Azure AD is just aware of them, or in the case of Azure AD registered devices. Azure AD joined devices means that that device trusts Azure to do the authentication for it. And then we've got hybrid AD joined, which means they're joined to the Active Directory domain services that's joined to Azure AD. As you can see from the previous slides, using the Azure AD portal to perform administrative tasks is not very difficult. It's actually quite an intuitive user interface to work with. However, if we need to perform bulk administrative activities, we need some slightly more powerful tools to help us with that. So maybe we've been given a list of 100 software developers that need to be granted access to Azure AD and to be added into some administrative roles in Azure. What's the best ways to do that? Fortunately for us, we have several options available to us. The first option is to be able to do a bulk user update using a comma-separated file. What we can do in Azure AD is download a blank CSV template that contains the relevant fields that we need to complete. Then we just go through and copy and paste or type in the various attributes of the user that match those fields. Once we finish putting that information into the spreadsheet, we can then upload it through this GUI here on the left-hand side, and Azure AD will parse through that CSV file and create the user objects for us based on the contents of that CSV file. We can also achieve similar things by using Azure PowerShell. Not only is there a bulk update function in Azure PowerShell that allows us to open up the PowerShell console to parse a CSV file in there and have the contents of that CSV file created as user accounts, but there are also commands within Azure AD that will allow us to individually create users and to specify their attributes of that user through there. Similar commands exist for reading, updating and deleting user objects, adding them to roles, adding them to groups, and so forth. One of the things that's important to understand is that what you could do with Azure PowerShell is you could type in each individual command, or you could tell the command to parse a file, or what you could do is create a script that will parse the file, perform the action, and move forward. Just as with the Azure PowerShell commanders, you can also do bulk administration using the Azure command line interface. That way you can use scripts or the command line interface to bulk import or to bulk create users. It's also possible with Azure AD to use the application programming interfaces that exist in Azure AD to automate account creations. So we can write some code in a Visual Studio project. Now that could be PHP, it could be Java, or it could be a Visual Studio .NET project. And what that project can do is send commands to the Azure APIs. There are modules within Visual Studio that contain the commands in there. So we can write software that can go away and create user accounts for us. That would be handy. Let's suppose we need to create like a custom sign-up tool for something for an application, or we need to create guest user accounts or grant people access to a membership or something. So that exists as an option too. Azure AD can manage relationships with client devices in a number of ways. The first one we need to be aware of for the exam is Azure AD registered devices. What that means is we've taken a laptop or a mobile device and we've registered it with Azure AD. What that means is somebody can use that laptop and be able to access Azure AD controlled resources using a device. Typically, registered devices are used for bring your own device. That's where somebody brings their own laptop or mobile device to work and they want to be able to access corporate resources from the laptop. However, the device itself is corporately owned and controlled. It's not corporately owned and controlled, it's personally owned and controlled. So sometimes what we may need to do is put a level of inspection on those devices called conditional access. And what that does is look to make sure the device is correctly configured before access is granted. So an example of being correctly configured might be, okay, yes, you can have corporate email, but only if you install the Outlook application and only if you encrypt the local device. There is a difference between an AD registered device and an AD joined device. Azure AD joined devices are ones that usually are organization owned. What that means is Azure AD join is intended for organizations that want to be cloud first or cloud only. Any organization can deploy Azure AD join devices no matter the size or the industry they work in. Azure AD join works even in a hybrid environment where we've hybrid connected or Active Directory domain services to Azure AD. That will enable access to both cloud and on-premise applications and resources from that Azure AD joined device. Remember, it's incredibly important to remember that Azure AD is not necessarily authenticating the computer. Azure AD is authenticating a user that is happening to authenticate by putting their username and password into the computer. The computer itself is not authenticated, although there are services like conditional access that will inspect the configuration of the computer to make sure it's being configured in line with our corporate policy. Active Directory domain services was first developed in the late 1990s, and the first release was issued just before the turn of the millennium. In those days, most organizations were very much an on-premise organization. There was no real such thing as the cloud. Most people access resources inside their companies. Over the last few years, the way organizations work has changed a lot. External partnership, outsourcing, and even business-to-business collaboration have become huge trends. So with Azure Active Directory, it provides a business-to-business collaboration service. What that means we can do is we can create guest accounts in Azure Active Directory. And what we can do there is we can basically have somebody else provide an identity to us. So for example, somebody might use a Microsoft Live account, or they might use a Gmail account or a Facebook account to authenticate. We can then grant them access to our company's resources. When they come to access those resources, they'll sign in to the Azure AD single sign-on page. And when they type in their username, they'll then be redirected to authenticate using their identity provider. So if it's a Microsoft account, it'll be sent to Microsoft. If it's a Facebook account, it'll go to Facebook to verify their identification. They'll then prove they are who they say they are and receive a token from that identity provider. They then use that token to access the resources in our environment. What that means is Azure AD allows business-to-business collaboration. We can securely share our applications and servers with guest users from other organizations, but we can contain control over our data. We do this without having to maintain an identity for the external person. They can still use their existing username and credentials, and at the same time, we don't have to get involved when they need to do a password reset. That means we can work safely and securely with external partners, even if they're large or small. Even if they don't have Azure AD or an IT department, we can still grant them access using something like a Facebook or a Gmail account. Azure AD provides a mechanism for sending out a simple invitation and redemption process that lets partners use their own credentials to access our company's resources. Essentially, they're able to register that identity and a guest account is created for them. We can even extend that as well, so our software developers can use Azure AD business-to-business APIs to customize invitation processes so they can allow people to access our applications using a guest account as well. In the labs, you're going to create and log on to Azure AD with a guest account. It's important that you follow through that lab to get some hands-on experience with this and to solidify your understanding of what guest accounts are and what they are used for. In Lesson C of Objective 5, we're going to take a look at how we implement hybrid identity management. The AZ-103 exam is going to test our knowledge of hybrid identity quite intensively. To be able to pass the exam, we need to be able to install and configure Azure AD Connect and configure advanced Azure AD Connect functionality like password hash, pass-through synchronization, password writeback, and also password synchronization. Before we discuss how to configure Azure AD Connect, it's important that we understand what hybrid identity is. So, essentially, many organizations will already have a Windows Server Active Directory domain, typically in their on-premises environment, although domain controllers can be hosted in Azure. What that means is they have a traditional Active Directory forest where their user accounts, their group objects, and their computers are enrolled. When people log on to resources like their workstation, or they log on to file shares or email accounts, typically what they're doing is authenticating against Windows Server Active Directory and being granted a token that allows them to access those resources. Now, with Azure and Azure Active Directory, the resources we're accessing are either Azure resources like virtual machines. Now remember, what we're accessing there is not the remote desktop session on those virtual machines. It's the Azure portal that will allow us to configure the resource of the virtual machine, not the actual operating system itself. Also, the things that Azure AD would control access to would be Azure AD resources, storage accounts, PaaS instances, but also as well, we can use Azure AD to authenticate users for third-party cloud applications, Office 365, Dynamics 365, and the Microsoft 365 suite. It's also possible to use Azure Active Directory to provide authentication for our own applications as well. So, what we want to achieve for our customers is the ability to do single sign-on. What that means is we take that existing on-premise Active Directory domain service and we join it with Azure AD to give us, we'll still have two separate directory services, but they'll work as if they were one. The first way in which we do that is to deploy a tool called Azure AD Connect. Effectively, Azure AD Connect is a server that you deploy in your environment. It requires a SQL Server database, and it will install some functionality that includes directory sync, which is an old component from Forefront Identity Manager that will replicate any user objects, group objects, passwords that we choose to select from the on-premise domain and replicate them into Azure. By replicating those username and passwords from on-premise to in Azure AD, what I'm able to do is authenticate against Azure AD and be authenticated using the same username and password that I would provide it to Azure AD. I can also use Azure AD Connect to implement a true single sign-on solution. So what will happen there is, if I try to log on to Azure Active Directory using an on-prem account, Azure AD will get involved in passing the authentication request back to Windows Server Active Directory. Additionally, we also have some extra functionality that Azure AD Connect implements as well, like AD Health. So what will happen there is the Azure AD portal has some health and diagnostics functionality built into it. Azure AD Connect will extend the ability of Azure AD to be able to monitor the health of your on-premises and Azure-based domain controllers, and also Azure AD Federation servers, and also as well if any Azure AD Connect servers will be managed by there. Some of the other functionality Azure AD Connect provides for us includes granular synchronization. What we can do there is we can target which organizational units, which groups, or which user objects we want to replicate into Azure by selecting on a particular Active Directory attribute. The idea is we might have privileged or sensitive accounts that we don't necessarily want to replicate from on-premises into Azure. We also use Azure AD Connect to perform password writeback. Azure AD provides a self-service password reset portal. So if a user comes in and resets their password in Azure AD is aware of their new password. Azure AD Connect's password writeback functionality will take that password and take a hash of it and write it back to the on-prem domain controllers. So effectively, we're resetting our password not only in Azure AD, but that password change is being reflected back to on-prem AD as well. Let's have a look through now the process to install and configure Azure AD Connect to perform directory synchronization. The first step is to go to Microsoft's website and download the latest version of the Azure AD Connect software. Now, that software gets updated very, very frequently by Microsoft, and that's because Azure AD changes very frequently. The APIs that it leverages and the functionality it provides are constantly evolving, so Azure AD Connect has to constantly evolve itself. Make sure you download the latest version that's available before you start the installation. Now, when we've downloaded Azure AD Connect installer, what we get is the Azure ADC installation file. It's just an MSI, but it's vitally important that when you run it as an administrator user. So you right-click it, select Run as Different User, and put in your administrative credentials in there. Once we've launched the Azure AD Connect installation wizard, we're going to see the following wizard. Let's go through each of the steps. On the first Express Settings page, what you're going to see there is just some confirmation of the steps that it's going to take care of for us. We can choose the Express Installation option if we've got a single Windows Active Directory forest that we want to synchronize with Azure AD. Our first step is to tell Azure AD Connect how it's going to authenticate with Azure AD. That means we need to provide a username and a password that have Azure AD Global Administrator credentials. It is vital we have those highly privileged accounts to do this because Azure AD Connect needs to be authorized to allow to synchronize users and to move passwords around. Therefore, we need to give a username with the Azure AD Global Administrator credential. Obviously, if we're going to be reading user objects out of and the password hashes out of Active Directory domain services and potentially writing passwords back in there, We also need to be able to provide Azure AD Connect with some credentials for Active Directory domain services. We need a service account that's a member of the Active Directory Domain Services Enterprise Administrators Group. Do bear in mind it needs to be an enterprise administrator. Member of just the domain admins group is not going to suffice. The install wizard is then going to go and sign us in to Azure AD and authenticate us. Once it's finished doing that, it's going to give us some guidance steps. One of the things that frequently comes up at this point is a little health check that tells us the Active Directory recycle bin hasn't been enabled. It's really important that we go and do that, and we need to do that using the Active Directory admin tools. Enabling the AD recycle bin will allow us to keep objects when they're deleted or accidentally deleted for a fixed period of time. Also, as well, it's going to tell us that synchronization is disabled. We're not actually going to be enabled, and we tell it to run our first synchronization, so that's fine. One of the things as well we need to make note of from this screen is that Azure AD Connect has identified the user to use an attribute in on-premise Active Directory called MSDS consistency GUID. We'll use that as the source anchor attribute. So we'll use that. We're basically telling Azure AD that it's going to use that as its primary attribute. So at this point, what we've done is we've installed the directory services synchronization software. We've installed Azure AD Connect. At this point, we haven't actually performed the synchronization as such. There are some additional tasks that we need to perform just to make sure that we're ready to start synchronizing. So you can see here in this screen, you can click on to view the current configuration of Azure AD Connect. We can customize synchronize options. We'll talk about those in a little while. We can refresh the directory schema, which means Azure AD Connect is going to read the AD schema and get a fresh copy of it. We're going to configure staging mode, which is currently set to disabled. So staging mode is where we get ready for synchronization. Then we can change the user sign-in that we used to sign into Azure AD, and we can update a certificate, an SSL certificate that we provide to Azure AD Connect to allow it to configure Active Directory Federation services for us. There's also a troubleshooting task we can use if we run into any problems with the installation. So we can always come back to this screen later on and use this to help us prep Directory and Azure AD to be ready for the directory synchronization. Now we've installed and configured Azure AD Connect, we need to perform our first initial synchronization. The wizard will guide us through this. What it is going to do, it is going to prompt us to enter the Azure AD credentials that we're going to use to perform the synchronization. So we need to authenticate again at this stage to move forward. Azure AD Connect needs us to provide a little bit more information about our forest at this stage. All we need to do is tell it what directory type we're going to be synchronizing from on-prem to Azure. It's entirely possible that we don't want to replicate every single user and every single group object from Active Directory domain services into Azure AD. Let's suppose we're just doing a deployment of Azure AD to support Azure resources. We don't need to necessarily add our users to Azure AD for that, so why bother synchronizing their accounts? That's why Azure AD Connect allows us to filter by OU, organizational unit, and by domain, so we can be selective in which user objects and which group objects are replicated to the cloud. Azure AD Connect is not only used for Azure Active Directory, it's also used heavily for Exchange integration. So there's some additional options in here to allow preview functionality to work in Office 365. There's some other optional features we can enable as well in Azure AD. These do need to be considered during the design phase though. If you're wanting to use Exchange Mail public folders in Office 365, we need to enable that feature here for the synchronization. Also as well, what we might want to be able to do is enable Azure AD application and attribute filtering, so we can restrict what attributes of individual objects we can replicate into Azure. Maybe we want to enable or disable password synchronization. So password synchronization is where we copy a hash of our password value from on-prem to Azure. Password writeback is where we take changes made to a password object and write it back to on-prem. Group writeback is some relatively new functionality. What that allows us to do is when we've got a self-service user portal in Azure and somebody comes along and asks to join a group through Azure AD, Their membership of that group is then written back to the group object on-prem. We've also got options for device writeback. That allows Azure AD to pass the information it holds on devices that are enrolled in it back to on-premises Active Directory. That comes in really handy for two scenarios. The first of which is when we're trying to do a bulk enrollment of devices into Azure Active Directory. It also comes in useful if we want to implement conditional access using on-premises Active Directory Federation services. We can also choose here as well to enable the directory extension attribute sync. What that means is Azure AD Connect will extend the Active Directory schema and add an extra attribute to every record in the schema. What that means then, we can individually mark particular objects in AD to say whether they should be synchronized or excluded from synchronization by the value of that attribute. It's important to note that it's quite a privileged activity. Modifying the Active Directory schema is not necessarily something that you should do lightly. Once we've given it those configuration settings and we've configured any additional optional features we want to enable, Azure AD is going to go ahead and perform the first synchronization for us. Now, depending upon the size of our Active Directory domain, that could take some time for it to complete. It's not unusual for initial synchronization to take anywhere from 15 minutes to 2 hours, depending on the size and the bandwidth available. There are a couple of administrative tasks we need to be aware of for managing Azure AD Connect. Now, Azure AD Connect itself has implemented some functionality that makes our lives a lot easier. For example, it'll automatically take care of synchronization for us on a schedule. It'll also allow it, if we tell it to do so, to automatically upgrade itself to the latest version to keep it supported. But there are a couple of activities that we need to be able to do as administrator to make sure that it's running correctly. The risk to our environment is that if Azure AD Connect fails, users may not be able to log on to resources controlled through Azure AD Connect. So, what are the things we need to do to keep Azure AD Connect up and running? We may need to be able to go in and add additional administrators and allow them the ability to configure the AD Sync service. We may need to be able to use Azure AD Connect to assign licenses for Azure AD Premium and for the Enterprise Mobility Suite, or for other enhanced features to users by specifying them in Azure AD Connect. Maybe we want to be able to schedule synchronization tasks like when we do password writeback or how frequently we replicate user objects across. We can manually start a synchronization task in there as well. So if we've just done, say, a bulk user creation job either in Azure AD or in AD domain services, we can tell it to perform a synchronization straight away. There's a whole bunch of other additional activities that you need to be aware of how to do them in Azure AD Connect. When you get into the labs, there's some exercises that are going to get you to go through each of these scenarios and perform some of these administrative actions. Being able to recreate these in the exam is not a priority, but being able to understand what you need to do and whether you do it through the Azure AD portal or through the Azure AD Connect administrative console is important for the exam. One of the jobs Azure AD Connect does for us is to synchronize the passwords of user objects. If we've got the same password for our user account in Azure as we have for our user account in Active Directory domain services, we can provide the same credentials and be authenticated regardless of whether we're being authenticated by Azure AD or by Windows Server Active Directory. So Azure AD Connect will synchronize our password for us. When we configure Azure AD Connect, there are two options we need to configure. The first one is to enable password synchronization. What that will do is allow Azure AD to be able to replicate our passwords from Windows Server AD into Azure AD. Then the password writeback option, if we enable that, what will happen then is when a user comes along and changes their password in Azure AD, either through a password reset or a self-service password reset, or just through a normal password change operation, that change gets reflected back into on-premises Active Directory as well. In Lesson 5D, let's take a look at how we implement multi-factor authentication to provide a greater degree of security control over who accesses the Azure portal. The Azure portal is like a massive remote control for our entire data center. Therefore, it's very important we can put some rigorous controls in place to make sure that when people access that portal, we've authenticated them and authorized them. So, one of the things Azure AD gives us to do that is multi-factor authentication. For the exam, we need to be able to configure user accounts to use multi-factor authentication. We need to be able to bulk update user accounts to make several or potentially hundreds of accounts be able to use multi-factor authentication. We need to be able to turn on and configure the functionality that allows Azure AD to monitor fraudulent activity alerts. And also as well to be able to configure one-time bypass, just in case somebody has temporarily forgotten or lost their mobile phone or their authentication app. We also need to be able to configure trusted IP addresses. So what we're doing there is whitelisting particular source IP addresses to say when a user connects from there, they're working from the office or they're working from a known location, so we don't need them to provide multi-factor authentication. And then finally, we also need to be able to configure the various verification methods that multi-factor authentication allows us to use to validate somebody's identity. Multi-factor authentication is quite simple. What it means is we prove we are who we say we are by providing a username, a password, and some other factor of authentication. Now, in the industry, there's several ways we can do that. One is to use an authentication app on our mobile phone. Most modern mobile phones will allow you to use a fingerprint or facial identity to prove your access when you log onto the device. So it's possible for us to extend that so we can actually use an authentication application, and the way we prove to the app that we are who we say we are is by doing facial recognition or a fingerprint ID. One of the things we can do as well is have Azure send us an SMS message that gives us a one-time password to allow us to log in. The idea here being is that as well as knowing my username and password, I also have to have a device with me that proves I am who I say I am. So if I've got my mobile phone, I'm proving I am who I say I am by saying I've got my mobile phone and I've proved it because you sent me an SMS or you sent a request to my application and I've approved it. The idea around multi-factor authentication is that passwords are inherently weak. To make them, to have a password that's uncomplex enough for a human being to have a reasonable chance of remembering it means that passwords are particularly easy to guess, especially in an age when attackers have access to huge amounts of processing resources, and there are some very intelligent things like dictionaries for passwords out there to fuel those attacks. So this is why most organizations are now moving beyond just username and password authentication. One of the big benefits of Azure AD is multi-factor authentication is built into it. If you were to try and build an MFA solution for yourself on-prem, you need to implement additional servers. You probably need to implement like a modem or a GPRS service to integrate to be able to send SMS messages. And that all took time and effort. With Azure AD, it's all designed and it happens out of the box. All we've got to do is turn it on and enable it and train our users to use it. One of the first steps we need to do to enable multi-factor authentication is in our Azure AD tenant, we need to enable the service. We also need to choose the authentication methods and our MFA policy that determines what users need to do. But before a user will be required to perform multi-factor authentication, we need to enable that user for multi-factor authentication. In each user's account, there is a little dialog box with a tick box next to it. By putting a check in that tick box, we're saying they have to use multi-factor authentication, otherwise they can't access their account. It's highly likely that when we enable multi-factor authentication, we may be identifying several or potentially several hundred users in one go to force them to use multi-factor authentication. That's why the Azure AD portal gives us a bulk update tool. Again, just like bulk creation of user accounts, what we can do is we can use the bulk update button in the multi-factor authentication users dialog box to download a blank CSV file, put in the names of the users and update that. We can also use the tick boxes in here to select multiple users in one go to enable them and require them to use multi-factor authentication. Alternatively as well, we can use the Azure command line interface, we can use Azure PowerShell, and we can use the Azure AD APIs to allow our software or to write scripts to be able to enforce that people use multi-factor authentication. Because Azure AD is a software as a service directory offering, it's possible for it to add in lots of enhanced functionality quite equally. One of the new bits of functionality that's come in is Azure MFA fraud alerts. Now that functionality has only recently come out of preview, but it's now involved in the exam, so you need to be aware of it. Effectively, if our users find that they get a request to perform a multi-factor authentication job that they didn't request, we can allow them to be able to just reply to the email and basically submit that as a fraud alert. So if all of a sudden, out of the blue, you get a multi-factor authentication request on your mobile phone or you receive the text message, we can allow users to report on that and say, look, somebody's trying to log on to our account and it's not me. Now, we can take some actions on that. The first one is whether or not we allow users to submit fraud alerts. The other thing we can do as well is if somebody reports a fraud, should we automatically block their account? Now, that could be seen to be quite a pragmatic thing to do. Somebody's tried to log onto your account, so we're going to block it. So nobody can log on until we've sorted this issue out. But it's something that you need to take into account. You need to have some dialogue with the business about this first. And specifically, you need to make sure what's the priority here. Is it to protect the account or is it to preserve the end user's functionality? What we can do as well is specify a greeting code to use. So if somebody wants to report a fraud, they quote that code in the message that they send through to us, or we can specify a combination of digits that we provide. Have you ever come to work and forgotten your mobile phone? It does happen from time to time, and it can happen to anybody. So the question then is, if you've forgotten to bring your phone to work, are you then able to log onto your applications? Are you able to get into your email and so forth? Possibly not. So one of the options that multi-factor authentication gives us is to allow administrators to be able to apply a bypass. What that means is somebody can ring up to the help desk and they can request that and basically report and say, look, I've lost my mobile phone, I've left it at home, I can't do multi-factor authentication at the moment, so I need to have a bypass for that. And the system administrator can choose to say, okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to allow that user to have a bypass. And we grant them a temporary period of time expressed in a number of seconds to say, okay, you can log in without providing multi-factor authentication for the next 3 hours, the next 3 days. They also need to specify a reason for that. So in this case, this unlucky user has dropped their phone in their toilet and they're waiting a repair. The whole idea here is, if somebody can't authenticate, that prevents them from getting on being productive. So one-time bypass allows us to give them a grace period to be able to log on without MFA if for some reason they don't have their device with them. Obviously, undertaking multi-factor authentication can slow people down ever so slightly. It does take a few seconds for a text message to receive, and as a human being, they've got to be able to react to that text message. It's entirely possible that what we might want to do is, for certain circumstances, make sure that users don't have to perform multi-factor authentication. So if somebody's working from home or working remotely, we might require them to use MFA, but if they're working from the office, maybe we assume, because of the fact that they're inside the corporate network, that they are who they say they are. So what we can do in our multi-factor authentication service settings is to allow trusted IPs. What we do in there is enable multi-factor authentication skipping, and we define a list of IP address ranges. The way we specify them is to type in the IP address subnet followed by its CEDA value, and we can add in up to several hundred IP address subnets. That way, if somebody connects, if their IP address is coming from that subnet, then it won't require them to perform multi-factor authentication. A word of warning about using public Class B and Class C IP addresses for this. You might be using 192.168 in your network, but what you need to make sure you provide is the public IP address of the router that users will be connecting from, rather than necessarily just the subnet itself from the source request. Azure MFA gives us a couple of verification methods we can choose. So for example, what I can do is say, I'm going to let users choose how they perform verification. The first option is to allow them to receive a telephone call. So that can be to a known office number, or it can be to their known mobile number. What will happen then is an automated service will ring through and it will say to them, this is Microsoft calling. We just want to identify you are who you say you are. Press 1 to acknowledge this message. And because they've received that call and they've pressed 1, it'll allow them to move on. But as well, if they haven't requested that call, they can press 2 and it can be reported as a fraudulent login attempt because somebody else has tried to authenticate. Another option is to have a text message sent to their mobile phone. That's quite good because they're not necessarily having to have a smartphone. If they've got a legacy mobile phone, as long as it can accept an SMS message, we can send a one-time password to that phone. If the users do have a smartphone, what we can do is we can send them a notification from the mobile app. That means they can install the Microsoft Authenticator app on their mobile device. When they attempt to log in, Azure AD will send a message to their enrolled application, and what will happen is a pop-up will appear on the screen. Depending on how that's configured, the user then can either use something like facial recognition, fingerprint ID, or just manually approve the request by ticking a button in the application. Alternatively, what we can do is the application, when we come to log on, can request from them a verification code that can be generated by the mobile application, or by a hardware token. We can still use things like RSA key fobs because Azure AD supports what's called an OTP password provider. So that's our way of integrating Azure AD with another vendor's hardware tokens. To make life a little bit easier for our users, what we can do is enable Remember Multi-Factor Authentication. What that means is when they log on, they'll be required to provide multi-factor authentication, say once every 1, 3, 5, 10 days. We can specify a number of days between 1 and 60. And what that means is when they provide multi-factor authentication, they won't be prompted to do it again for a certain number of days. Now, the higher the number of days you make that grace period be, the more convenient it is for users. However, the level of risk grows with that. I would suggest that if you do enable Remember Multi-Factor Authentication, maybe just having it for 1 or 2 days is a pragmatic balance. That way people aren't constantly having to go to their device and authenticate, but at the same time there's a good level of, if somebody does get in there, it can only be done for a certain period of time. Let's have a look at the lab exercises that you're going to do to prepare yourself for the AZ-103 exam. In Lab 5, there are several exercises that it's quite important you go through, mostly because actually doing these activities will take the theoretical knowledge you've learned from watching these videos and these sessions and turn that into practical hands-on experience. And that's generally the best way to learn how to do something. It's entirely possible in the AZ-103 exam that you'll be given simulation questions, where you'll get to a point where after doing several multiple choice questions, it will open up a version of the Azure portal and it will expect you to follow some tasks to implement a solution. So hands-on experience is incredibly important for the 103 exam. So the exercises we're going to get you to complete in this lab include, we're going to create an Azure AD tenant and we're going to apply a custom domain to it. We'll then verify that custom domain by creating a host record in it, and we'll use that to verify that we own that domain. That will then allow us to have a custom domain name in Azure AD. We're going to do a lab on Azure AD join. And what we'll do there is basically take a computer or a device and register it or join it into Azure AD. We'll configure self-service password reset. We'll create a couple of subdirectories in an Azure AD tenant and use that to divide out where we store particular types of user accounts. We're then going to do a lab on managing Azure AD objects where we'll create several users by bulk, create several users through the GUI, and also use the PowerShell and command line interface to be able to create and manipulate user objects, moving them into and out of groups. Then there's a lab on implementing hybrid Active Directory, and finally implementing multi-factor authentication. Thanks very much for taking the time to watch this video. Good luck with the labs, and I'll see you on the next module.